My name is Zhenya. I'm a PhD student, author, and also a survivor of severe childhood trauma. And today I want to discuss the pretty damaging narrative that childhood trauma or trauma in general somehow irreversibly breaks us, and that we are therefore condemned to a life of suffering. And I can tell you, as a childhood trauma survivor myself, that this is not true. And that we simply believe this is true because, first of all, culturally, it is a myth that is perpetrated. And second of all, because trauma genuinely does make our life more difficult. And that's due to the nature that unprocessed trauma symptoms take, which is that we have, like, as trauma survivors, we often have emotions we can't explain, or we have difficulties in personal relationships. But all that doesn't mean that we are somehow cursed. It just means that we have unprocessed trauma that can be healed and that can be treated. And I can personally say that it is possible as a trauma survivor to live a healthy and happy life. And so that's what I want to go into today, by explaining some more about my personal story and hello in the chat, by explaining something about by going into my personal story first, like my background, my family background and what traumatized me, but more importantly, my healing journey and what really helped me process these symptoms I speak of, and what helped me find the blessings in the events that took place in my childhood. So yeah, if there aren't any questions about that, again, can someone please confirm that you can hear me and see me? And then I can start going into the content for today. Loud and clear. Thank you, Etta. Okay, so my story. As I said, my name is Zhenya. I'm from an Eastern European immigrant working class background. And growing up, my childhood home was very volatile. It was a chaotic environment, mostly due to the unprocessed trauma of both my parents. And at this point, I want to say that I don't blame my parents for what happened, because my parents were very unhealthy people that still tried their best. And so this will become important later. But of course, as a child, that wasn't much help to me, because as I said, the environment was very chaotic. I was frequently witness to emotional and verbal violence. And I was also the victim of that. And so the general feeling the general emotion I had as a child was stress, if you can call that an emotion. And the general feeling I had about my home environment and life was that I was unsafe. And that really became a reoccurring theme in my life, this feeling that I was unsafe and that somehow I had to manage other people's emotions, that I had to be perfect in order to not anger them and therefore not endanger myself. And so when I moved out at 18 years old to go to university, I went to university in a different city. I pretty quickly became aware of the effects of my childhood on me, because I had all these symptoms I described earlier. I was very emotionally volatile and frequently extremely insecure in personal relationships. I tried to cover up, or I tried to make myself feel safe through perfectionism, both at work and my personal life. And that essentially led to me being just like a person living in a constant anxiety attack. So these symptoms became too severe for me to ignore. And around 20 years old, I came to realize the effects of my childhood, and that all these symptoms were the direct result of my childhood experience. So at around 21 years old, I entered therapy, and I was in therapy for a good 3.5 years in total. Um, and that was a very important step for me because it meant acknowledging that I had been victimized as a child, which I wasn't always able to admit. But at the same time, therapy became kind of a crutch for me, I believe, because my therapy consisted of rehashing traumatic events from my life. And again, while I feel that was a very important step in that it allowed me to acknowledge what had been done to me, that should have been the first step, but it became the only step for many years. And so while I was in therapy, I still had these terrible anxiety symptoms, and I still was repeating the same mistakes over and over again, both in my professional and my personal life. And I believe the biggest issue there was that I had entered therapy based on the idea that I was broken and that I needed to be fixed, and that someone outside of myself could fix myself. In this case, my therapist. And that is actually a very damaging belief to hold, and something I might go into later. But essentially, that really hindered me from making the most of my therapy. I also had some personal difficulties with my therapist, but I won't go into that here. But essentially, after I left therapy, I still was, after 3.5 years of therapy, mind you. Sorry, someone wrote something in the chat. I've always wondered if only revisiting the trauma is like picking at a scab. Exactly, that's exactly what it felt like to me. Again, it was very useful for me to acknowledge acknowledge the patterns that existed in my childhood, and also to acknowledge specific very hurtful events that had happened in my life. But I feel like that process, yeah, it only started, but it never really ended. So by the time I left therapy, I had done a lot of that picking at the scab of my childhood, but I didn't feel like I had actually processed a lot of it. And so I still had the same trauma symptoms as before. And actually, very soon after I left therapy, about 2 months actually, had a very severe personal crisis. And that a really rock bottom moment. It was the worst time of my adult life. And but that also led me to really question this idea that someone outside of myself could fix me, because I had tried that, right? I had tried it in therapy, and I had tried it in a romantic relationship. And when I realized that that couldn't happen, that I was responsible for my life, that really became the catalyst for what I call my healing journey. And so that what I call my healing journey really consisted of going not only into the events of my childhood and my youth, but asking myself what beliefs about life and about people I had inherited from my family and I had learned during my childhood. And I understood that I actually thought the world was a very dangerous, volatile, and unsafe place. And questioning that belief was very difficult, but it opened a door of possibility for me, namely the possibility that health was possible for me. And I will go into, maybe I'll go into the specific practices that helped me a bit later. But as part of that process of questioning my beliefs about the world and therefore also myself, I began to feel less anger at my parents. Because before that, I had a very, and understandably so again, I think, difficult relationship with my parents. I blamed them for what had happened to me because essentially I believed that they should have been better. And as part of that healing journey, I really began to dig into my family history. And I began to understand that my parents had actually never had the chance to be better than they had been. And they had tried their best. But they themselves had been victims of severe abuse. And they themselves had never had the resources to heal, to process that trauma. And inevitably, those symptoms had been taken out on me. And understanding that really depersonalized their actions from me. Again, I hadn't deserved what had happened, but I began to understand that it hadn't happened to me because I was somehow unworthy of love and safety. It just I had just been a victim of circumstance. And realizing that helped me to lessen the hold I had on the identity of a victim. And that was another big catalyst for me. Understanding that just because I had been victimized, I didn't have to accept that I was a victim. And that's why also in the beginning of this life, I didn't say, yeah, I'm a trauma victim, but actually that I'm a trauma survivor. Because I don't define myself by what was done to me, but I define myself by who I chose to become. And as part of that healing journey, I really began to reclaim the blessings, or rather, I began to find the blessings in my trauma. And I'd like to go into that first, unless there are any questions or comments about that. Okay, since there are no questions. So the blessings in my trauma, of course, this I understand why this idea might cause you some resistance if you're a trauma survivor yourself, because yeah, trauma sucks, and there's there's only so much positive reframing you can do. It will always hurt. Certain events will always hurt. Certain neglect will always hurt, but that doesn't mean that you can't find something positive for yourself in it. And I realized this when I began to understand how much of my personality is really formed by my childhood trauma. And at first, that was disorienting because I thought, like, I wondered if I'm just my trauma, then what am I? Who am I? Because I feel that for people who experience trauma later in life, they have something to compare themselves to. They can remember a version of themselves before the trauma occurred and after the trauma occurred. But people like me, childhood trauma survivors, we don't have that. There is no me beyond those events. And as I said, I realized that a lot of my personality, so I'm very much type A. I'm very detail oriented. I'm hyper aware usually, not only of details in like a technical sense, but also the people around me. I can be very emotional, but I also can be very analytical. And people often tell me that I'm very empathic. And so all of these I can directly link back to my childhood experience of living in, as I mentioned, a very volatile environment where an seemingly innocent comment can tick someone off and cause a cascade of events that are very scary for a child. And so, because I had to navigate that environment as a child, I became hyper aware of people's emotions and of their behavior. And I became very good at recognizing patterns in that behavior. And when my trauma wasn't processed, wasn't healed in that aspect, I would, for example, I would have a conversation with a person and I would see that they would wrinkle their nose. And that would send me down a spiral of assuming that I knew what they were thinking, namely that they were somehow angry at me, assuming that this was endangering our relationship, and therefore that I was in danger. And I think you can see how this really contributed to my terrible anxiety. And the same can be said for being detail oriented. I used to be terrified of sending out work emails because I was terrified of making a mistake, making a typo, my boss seeing that typo, my boss thinking I'm stupid, my boss firing me, my reputation being ruined. And what I just said for the being hyper aware of people's emotions, obviously you can see how this connects to being empathic, right? Because that's essentially what being empathic means. And as I said, while my trauma was unprocessed, all this caused me a great amount of stress. But the amazing thing is that is a great example, nose wrinkle. Yeah, exactly. It's like the people will have these tiniest facial expressions that have nothing to do with you, absolutely nothing. Maybe they're thinking about, I don't know, having to do taxes or having to pick up their grandmother or whatever. But in your head, when you're so hyper aware, um, you will make it all about you. What unprocessed trauma made me extremely self-centered, and that I thought that everyone on the planet was always looking at me and always was waiting for me to fail. So yeah, um, as I said, while my trauma was unprocessed, this caused all these traits caused me a lot of pain. But the amazing thing is that now that I'm more healed, I still have these traits. I'm still empathic. I'm still very much aware. I'm still very detail oriented. But I've lost the stories I tell. I've lost essentially, I still have the ability to see when someone is less energetic than usual, when they seem a bit down, or when they seem a bit angry. But I don't immediately make it about myself. I don't immediately make it mean that I've somehow made them mad and that I'm somehow in danger. Instead, I now have the ability to just ask them. I can just ask, hey, are you okay? You seem a bit more quiet today. And that's actually made me a better friend and a better partner, or at least I like to believe so. So that was the first blessing I found in my trauma, the ability to recognize the traits I like most about myself are actually a direct result of that trauma, and that I can be proud of them, even though their origin might not be what I would like it to be. And the second blessing I've really found in my trauma is my resilience. And so I remember a few years ago, I saw a meme. I don't know where it was, but it said something along the lines of, "Oh, you can't insult me, or you can't hurt me. My mom has said worse." And so this is a bit like some dark humor here, but essentially, it's true. I've had some very interesting situations in my life where people thought they could, I don't know, insult me or intimidate me, something like that. And it just didn't land. It legitimately didn't land because I didn't have the ability to be scared of them, or to register what they had said as an insult. Because, as I said, I grew up in an environment where verbal abuse was very much the norm. And while it isn't good that this was normalized for me, it also made me much more. It couldn't shock me in the way it might have otherwise. And there's something else to be said about resilience. Let me just plug in my charger. Um, Namely, that I quickly learned to overcome adversity. Necessarily so. I think this isn't just connected to my childhood trauma, but as I mentioned, I'm from an immigrant working class background, and I I went to university. I finished my bachelor's, my master's degree. I'm now doing a PhD, and that is a very much elitist environment. And I feel like my early experiences in life actually served me well, because I learned early that I had to fight for what I want. And that can also be like a toxic belief. Life doesn't always have to be hard, and I'll talk about that some other time. But but the adversity I had to overcome as a child prepared me for the times when life was hard, when it was difficult, and it allowed me to learn that I could, like, when push comes to shove, I can pull through. And I've actually seen this play out in my personal relationships, where numerous times I saw people who objectively had much more privileged and secure backgrounds than me struggle with things I could overcome easily. And this is not to toot my own horn, or to talk badly about them, but I could see a pattern where they had not had these experiences in early life, where they had to struggle for something. And so they never learned that sometimes you have to work for things, or you have to grow a thicker skin. They had never been put in these environments where they had to learn these lessons. And so when they had to learn them as young adults, it was much more difficult for them. And I simply never had that experience. Of course, I had times where I was where I was in conflict about what I wanted and what I thought I was able to do, but never to the same degree. I never. I learned to act before I felt ready, and that's really one of my biggest strengths to this day. Yeah, I could go on and on about this, but I feel like these are some just the first examples that come to my mind. And now I would like to go a bit into the practices that actually helped me make that transition from feeling that I was so broken, that I had to be fixed, and to recognizing that no, I was actually never broken. I was unhealthy, yes, but someone who is unhealthy can be healed, right? It's like, maybe this is a bad example because the scope is quite different. But for example, when I have a cold, I don't take that on as my identity, right? When I have a cold, I recognize, okay, there are some symptoms. There are common knowledge treatments, and I simply have to rest. I have to allow my body to heal. And once I've done that, I'm healthy, and I don't have to take this on as an identity of, oh, I'm just a person with a cold. And again, the scope, of course, is quite different because a cold is something temporary and trauma is something you carry with you throughout life. But this is just to illustrate the identity piece. So if there are any questions or comments about finding the blessings in the trauma, feel free to tell me. Otherwise, I'll go into the practices that really help me. Okay. Seem to be no comments or questions about that. So I would say that all these gems and realizations I've just talked about, these really came when I stopped only talking about my trauma and the traumatic events that had occurred in my life, but I actually started healing my nervous system. Because something that never came up in my therapy that I had to discover on my own is that trauma isn't psychological, but it's neurological. And that means that trauma imprints on your nervous system and your brain. And this might sound like terrible news, because if it imprints in your brain, then what are your hopes? But there's actually a lot of hope, because we know the concept of neuroplasticity. That means that your brain is shaped by your life, but your brain can also be, it's not just shaped by your past, but it can also be shaped by your actions in the present. And therefore, if you have a dysregulated nervous system, about which I'll talk in a future video. And so if you have a dysregulated nervous system due to your trauma, you can teach your nervous system to be regulated, and therefore you can decrease the severity of your trauma symptoms. So nervous system regulation. Nervous system regulation was really the biggest leap in my trauma healing journey. And I think beliefs, often deeply seated and not necessarily obvious, are strong contributors to how we are triggered. Definitely. And these beliefs I'm mentioning now, obviously I wasn't conscious of them back then, right? When beliefs are things we take as truth, they aren't. I don't think that I just believe this. I think that this is genuinely how the world works, and I really believe that something was too damaged within me to be fixed. So, and these things gradually come to the surface as we go into a trauma. And I'm still uncovering a lot of beliefs to this day. Earlier I mentioned that my trauma is healed. What does healed even mean? Because obviously I still have a brain and a body that is formed by trauma, and that is something I will carry with me throughout my life. That means that throughout my life, I will be discovering beliefs that I carry with me due to my trauma. So that's a very good point. It's a very good point that beliefs contribute to how we are triggered. And as we regulate our nervous system, that actually allows us to investigate these beliefs, because as we regulate our nervous system, we become less frequently triggered. And that in turn allows us to really do that deep work of going into our beliefs and changing our mindset. Yeah, as part of that nervous system regulation, I also learned to regulate my emotions because, as I mentioned, I used to have very volatile emotions, and still to this day, I'm very sensitive. I'm very deeply moved by a lot of things. I cry very easily, and it doesn't matter whether I'm sad or I'm just very feeling very loving to someone. I will cry very easily. And but I learned to manage my emotions in the sense that I didn't have to throw them on the first person I saw. I didn't have to hot potato my emotions onto the people around me, because I used to be very dysregulated in the sense that I didn't know how to, if I had a bad day, I didn't know how to take care of that emotion. I had to tell someone, I had to vent to them. And that was also very toxic and just unhealthy behavior, because other people aren't, then I don't know what it's called, when you're on the plane and you have to throw up and they give you a little bag. That's essentially how you're treating other people when you're frequently venting to them. And that's behavior I stopped, because as I learned to regulate my nervous system, I automatically learned how to regulate my emotions. And by journaling, by meditating, by taking walks in nature, by doing all these things that help empower me in stabilizing my emotional state. And and so these were all like practices, habits, mindset shifts that I developed over years, right? But what also came with that was that I really had to develop a lifestyle that facilitated my nervous system healing and my trauma healing. Because, as I mentioned before, I will always carry these symptoms with me. And I noticed that especially when I don't take care of myself, because these symptoms will flare up. And so I really have to be self-loving in the aspect that I have to understand what triggers me. I have to understand what calms me down. I have to make sure that I include these practices as part of my daily life. And so that I may continue to heal. And so that's like the broad overview of my trauma healing journey, of finding my blessings in that journey and the practices that really made a difference for me. And does anyone have any questions or any comments to make? Taking another sip of water. So this was a very high level overview, and actually expand on this much more in the book I'm currently writing. It's called Don't Fix Yourself. And as you can tell, it's based on the premise I introduced today, that you are not broken, but that you are unhealthy, and that you can treat that lack of health. And I'm writing this book first to really, on the one hand, find closure for this part of my life, but also to truly integrate the lessons of these last years. Because what I'm writing about in the book is essentially what I introduced today, except that in the book the book is written from a much more practical standpoint. So there I don't only talk about the theory, but very much about the practice of how to include journaling, how to include meditation in your life. Why is it important? And I know that you've probably heard about this a dozen times before, but this book is not supposed to be a theoretical book, but it's more of a workbook. There are lots of exercises there that will help you integrate the theoretical knowledge. And it's supposed to be a guide to help empower you to take charge of your own healing journey. And so I will be doing these live sessions weekly on Wednesdays, where I'll go into the concepts from the book some more. And you can subscribe to my newsletter to keep up with that. It's called Holistic Success, and it's where I teach people like me, essentially high-achieving trauma survivors, to live a fulfilling, well-balanced life. Or you can, if you say, you can subscribe to this channel to make sure that you keep up to date with the these weekly workshops or live streams, or however you want to call them. Or of course, you can already pre-order the book if you're convinced by today's video that this is something for you. But either way, I hope that I could give you some food for thought. And yeah, I'd love to see you here again. I'll wait for a moment whether there are any more comments or thoughts, and then I'll close the live stream. Oh, and all these things I mentioned, the newsletter and the book pre-order, are in the description box. Okay, no questions, but just some comments. Thank you. Yeah, I'm glad it was helpful. Yes, and feel free to always message me if you have any more comments about what you'd see live streams on. You can find me on Twitter, or as I said, on my newsletter. And yeah, I'm still in the process of writing this book, which is why I'm discussing these concepts on here, so that I can develop them some more. I can see what lands for you or what doesn't. And because I really, as I said, I really want to make this book a practical guide for people who've tried doing it the right way, right? Therapy, whatever, but for whom it hasn't worked. Because all the practices I talk about in the book would really move the needle for me. So yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I'm glad. Okay, then thank you so much for your attention. And I'll see you next Wednesday. Goodbye.